Have you ever found yourself in Ukraine covering the war and got into a situation where you thought this is just too risky? This is too much of a close shave, and I really need to reconsider whether it's worth the cost of going out to Ukraine.
There have been a couple of really hairy moments, really hairy moments. 25th of February, second day of the war, we were standing on the lee of that road on the edge of Kharkiv. I mean, I could see if when we popped our heads above the turret, above the sort of the edge of the road, the lip of the road, we could see that the turret of that Russian tank, perhaps sort of 30, 40 yards away. And then the sounds of Russian artillery sort of thumping over, or screaming over our heads and exploding beyond us. But that was my first experience of being on the wrong end of artillery, and that was pretty sort of jarring. And all the soldiers we were with were sort of diving for cover, but there wasn't really any cover to take other than to press their bodies into the snow, and we did the same thing. And then months later, or a few weeks later rather, in April, so yeah, a couple of months later in April, on Easter Sunday, we found ourselves, I mean, Kharkiv was getting shelled by rockets, mainly Grad rockets, but all kinds of Russian rocket artillery all the time. And there was a situation where we found ourselves, with an ambulance crew, two people had been wounded by a blast. We'd gone to report on what the ambulance crew was doing. And while we were there, another bombardment, came in, and everybody, soldiers, civilians, medics, was scrambling for cover. But funny enough, with a situation like that, at the time, it all happened so quickly that instinct takes over, and you hope perhaps training takes over. Although, I mean, I found myself cowering next to a flower pot, a sort of municipal flower pot, so perhaps a large, heavy stone flower pot. I suppose it might have protected me if the rocket had landed on the other side, but it's all over pretty quickly. What I found is that later that summer, for example, we'd gone back, and we'd had a situation where we went. What I was going to say is, what I found is that your imagination is often worse than reality. So the most scary times are not necessarily when things are happening. It's when you're waiting for things to happen, and you start to wonder and imagine all the things that could possibly go wrong. And I definitely had that later that summer, the first summer of the war, because my second child was weeks away from being born, and I had gone to meet some British fighters who were on what was then the front line near Mykolaiv and Kherson province. And it was one of those situations like I was describing at the beginning. People think you're mad for going there to begin with, but then they're quite flattered. And I think because we'd got there and we got further than we'd expected to get, and we were staying with them in an underground, in a cellar where they were based, and there were Ukrainian forces based nearby. We spoke to the Ukrainian commander, and he said, asked us what we wanted to see, and we sort of gave him a shopping list. I was expecting him to say no to most of it, and maybe yes to one thing or something, and he said yes to all of it. And so on the final serial flight, the final thing we got to report on was to see a Ukrainian T-72 tank in action. And again, it was all slightly chaotic, and they just said, right, be here at this time, and the tank will appear, because the tanks are obviously very well hidden all the time, so they can't be hit by Russian drones. And he said, the tank will drive to position, you can go with it, see it doing what it does. We'll speak to the crew either before or afterwards, and then get out of there. And I assume the tank would drive to a cover position in a tree line, perhaps where it might have prepared. So often you see they sort of dig like shell scrapes, but for tanks with diggers. I thought it might go to something like that, where we'd be hidden and there would be cover, but it drove into the middle of an enormous field. And in fact, it was on a road, and the road was slightly raised from the field. So it was the opposite of cover. We were on the only bit of elevated ground for, a mile in every direction. And it just started sort of blasting its targets. And the commander had said that they normally got 6 or 7 shots off before they received counter battery fire. And so we were sort of expecting to scarper after about 2 or 3, but the counter battery fire, the return fire, came in much, much sooner, and it was all a bit complicated because we'd be deafened by the sound of the tanks, so we couldn't hear the incoming stuff coming in. There was all, quite a lot of things happening on that occasion. And luckily the people I was with, I was just off the road in the field. We were photographing and filming the tank. Luckily, other people I was with had seen the fire coming in. They'd seen the shells landing, and they sort of grabbed us and moved us out, and we disappeared. But, I mean, serious credit to the tank crew. The tank crew stayed and carried on, they carried on their fire mission, carried on shooting at their target for some, I think they got off, all 10 rounds, which was their plan, as the Russian artillery got closer and closer to them. But, they were working on the basis that the Russians are inaccurate, artillery is inaccurate, and it was having to be sort of called in ever closer. And unless they got hit with a direct hit, they knew that inside the tank they'd be all right, and they made it back. So
Can we ask you about how do you balance personal life with the absolute demands of a war correspondent? You mentioned your baby earlier. Yeah, so is that difficult?
yeah, it's really difficult, and the stakes are much, much higher. When I started out doing this in 2006, or when I first went to Kabul, I was a young single man in my 20s with no real responsibilities, and it was very easy to go for long periods. Well, I lived abroad for 5 years in Afghanistan, and after that, I lived abroad for 5 years in Kenya, and I didn't have children, and I could do dangerous things. And ultimately, if something terrible happened to me, it would happen to me alone. And my parents might dispute that, but it's a very different equation now that I'm a father. Very, very different equation, and I know, and the risks are much, much higher, and that weighs very, very heavily on me when I'm making those decisions to go and do those things. And the first dangerous reporting role I did as a father was when Kabul was falling to the Taliban. And, I was reflecting very heavily on whether I was being completely irresponsible by flying into Kabul, because everyone was leaving, and you have that strange sensation as the journalist of going against the tide of humanity. And as we sat in an airport in Al Udeid Airport, which is a joint Qatari-US airbase, and the Qataris were running a flight in, and they'd allowed some journalists to come in with them. I remember asking a very experienced colleague of mine, who's I'd say a professional, a role model. I asked him whether he'd ever written a kind of "in the event of my death" letter to his children or something like that. And I think perhaps because he didn't want to contemplate that at that time, his response was pretty sharp. He said, "No, because I think dying on an assignment would be the greatest dereliction of duty," which I thought was one way of avoiding the dilemma. But I found myself, I did find myself sort of writing in my notebook that kind of letter, and I've reread it, and it's an attempt. It sort of reflects my own fears that I was feeling, and in a way, it's an attempt for me to justify what I'm doing. But I don't think that, in a way, what we do is sometimes very, very selfish. Because whilst I think war reporting is really important, um, I also think it's really rewarding. And I think if war reporters are honest, they'll say they do it for themselves, because they love it, because it's so rewarding. You know, part of that reward is knowing that you're doing something noble, and that sounds a bit pompous, but that is part of the reward. But it's also exhilarating, it's exciting, and professionally very, very rewarding. So that letter, I found myself trying to justify the what I was doing, and I'm not sure if that justification would stand up to scrutiny were, my son to find himself fatherless, or now my children, because now I have two, to find themselves fatherless. But so yeah, that's a long answer of saying yes, it weighs very, very heavily.
Can I just ask about the mindset of a war correspondent?
Um, well, I suppose, I mean, fundamentally, I think it's the same mindset of every journalist, which is that you go to where the story is because you want to report the story. And the difference is that the stories that we choose to report on are sometimes the ones that are happening where the fighting's happening, either, where the shells and the bullets are landing, and the rockets and the missiles. I mean, cruise missiles sometimes in Kharkiv. Absolutely sort of phenomenal firepower being unleashed by Russia against Ukraine. Um, but I think in that sense, the mindset's very simple. And also, it's the same as the journalism that happens, or the journalism that we commit, that we do in war zones, is the same as the journalism that people do all around me here in the newsroom in London, or not in the newsroom. It's the journalism people do when they leave the newsroom and they go and speak to the people to whom the news is happening, or to whom the news, who are being affected by the news. And that's it. Because it's a cliche, but it's about people. Of course it's about people. It's about the the old and the frail who are left behind, whether that's in Lysychansk, forced to cook on wood in the sort of alleys behind their buildings because there's no power and there's no electricity. Or similarly, it's about the people left behind in occupied Kursk in Russia, because they couldn't flee. They didn't have cars, or they didn't find a way to get out as the Ukrainians advance in that kind of lightning assault in August. And it's the people in Kyiv, it's the people in Lviv, it's the people all over Ukraine who are living with the uncertainty and the fear that their way of life, their independence, their identity, their freedom is under threat.